All right. Thanking God this time for the way that he helps us through growing pains. Let's call chapter 7 or Acts chapter 7 growing pains as well. This time, though, is we get to see the way in which the church overcomes the growing pains of loss as they are going to actually lose Stephen, one who now seems to be one of their more pivotal or foundational members in this chapter that begins with the high priest, as we might have mentioned in the last chapter, asking Stephen whether the allegations against him are true, leading to Stephen in the first 8 verses. Instead of directly answering with a yes or no, giving them a recount of Israel's history that might seem to be off topic, but might actually be developing a recurring pattern in Israel's history that has everything to do with answering their question. As if I haven't already mentioned it, the first 8 verses are going to describe the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God's promise through Abraham to make them a great nation. But that promise of a great nation to come is going to pass through Egyptian captivity, as he's going to say within those first 8 verses, as he's going to bring their descendants into Egyptian oppression. He is going to bring judgment onto their oppressors. But as we have mentioned in the first few chapters of Acts, the challenges that they face as the early church aren't simply external, they're going to become internal. And that's what we're going to see in verses 9 through 16 as he shifts his focus to Joseph, who is going to essentially be oppressed and rejected by his own brothers, but still exalted by God, not necessarily just amongst his brothers as they are going to sell him into slavery, but that slavery is going to lead him to be exalted in Egypt, putting him in a position to save not only his family, but the entire nation during the famine that's going to take over that entire region. But just as Joseph was rejected and exalted by God, still verses 17 through 44 are going to show the way that God delivers Israel out of Egyptian captivity through Moses, a man who is himself rejected by his own people, as God is going to exalt him anyway. Verses 17 through 29, giving us the first of 3 40-year periods. At the end of his first 40 years of age, going to look after his people. He is going to take up for one of them as an Egyptian is abusing him, and he is going to kill the Egyptian. But they are not going to realize that he is actually there on their behalf, and they are going to turn on him and basically put him at jeopardy by saying they're threatening essentially or insinuating that they might tell what he did to the Egyptian, causing him to go into 40 years in flight or 40 years in Midian. After those 40 years, God is going to exalt him in many ways through the famous story of the burning bush, through which he is going to communicate what is about to happen through Moses, and that is the delivery of the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, as we have mentioned. So he's going to discuss that in verses 30 through 38, leading to verses 39 through 44, that final set of 40 years where he is going to lead the children of Israel around the wilderness as they are going to continue to make his life miserable, my paraphrase. But God's going to describe the way, Stephen's going to describe the way that God observed the way that as a reward for him exalting Moses to lead the people out of bondage, the people are going to repay him by making his time difficult. But he's then going to talk about the next period, or one of the later periods in Israel's history, as one of the things they get during that period is the tabernacle. But David is going to have it on his heart to turn that into a more permanent dwelling place once the people have gotten the kingdom. And he's going to talk about the way that the tabernacle became the temple, and David became pivotal in that role. And even though Stephen is not going to describe it, if we know David's history, we probably recognize likewise the way that he was rejected amongst his brothers, yet still exalted by God to be king of the entire nation anyway. And so that pattern of men who were rejected by the people still being exalted by God is going to lead to the conclusion that Stephen is going to reach in verses 51 through 53, as he is going to talk about the way that the nation has a habit of resisting the Holy Spirit and likewise harassing the prophets, through which the Spirit is often communicated to the people. And likewise, when he ends that early diplomacy, maybe in the form of a long, protracted history, taking the shape of a pattern they didn't catch until he cinches the trap, at least his logical trap at the end. Eventually, once they get it, they're going to be irate. And in verses 54 through 60, they are going to storm him and conclude the chapter with the famous stoning of Stephen, which we'll see late in this chapter or early in the next. be something that Saul, who will become the Apostle Paul, something that he fully approved of, as we're going to see, something that one of my preaching instructors back in the day helped me to see. And that is one of the last times we will see Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father, as he was described as leaving the earth to go sit at the right hand of the Father. But when Stephen looks up into heaven and seems to get a vision of the throne of God, he seems to see Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father, a point that my instructor suggested might be an indication that Christ stood in honor of the conscious sacrifice, what seems to be the conscious sacrifice that Stephen made to put himself at risk of being martyred in the same way that Christ was.